Cheers, everybody. I'm recording this in the kitchen because Allie's sleeping and it's her birthday. So it's especially important that you don't wake her up on her birthday, right? And be respectful. So I'm in the kitchen. This is my kitchen and I'm recording another video. And it's actually the second video in a series I kind of want to start about radical thinking. But it's going to be the first video that I probably post because I want to introduce the idea of radical thinking, because if I just jump right into it, people are going to just think I'm crazier than I am, and I want to make some stuff clear. So really this whole video is going to be about defining radical thinking, and also me not worrying about how much time I'm going to spend on this video, because these are going to be long. I mean, I'm going to be talking about some complicated stuff, so I'm not going to worry too much about my my time wasted. So if you're here, you're here. I mean, if you want to leave, that's fine, man. You're just watching a fucking video, dude. Just leave, take a break, or just leave and like live your life. It's up to you. So anyway, I want to define radical thinking in really the way I see the word radical, which is very different from, I think, our common understanding of that word. And so let's begin. First off, welcome. You're a human being watching a video. When you were born, when all of us were born, we all started off as children, right? As small, wet, slimy babies. And we came out of our mother and we started flourishing and having a certain kind of mind. And if you remember, we probably don't, but if you remember, children will believe pretty much anything. And by pretty much anything, I mean anything. Like, if you notice, children are never surprised. I mean, children are amazed by everything, which is amazing. But they are not surprised by anything, in the sense that they don't have expectations for what life is. Like, you don't ever see like a 3-year-old playing with an iPad and they go, man, this iPad is like crazy. It's crazy that technology can do this these days. I mean, a 3-year-old is just kind of amazed by life in general. They're going to be amazed by a balloon. They're going to be amazed by a piece of cold ice. They're going to be amazed by life. But an iPad is not crazier than a piece of ice or more amazing than the ocean. It's all amazing. Unlike somebody who's much older, who's like, oh, there's the ocean, oh, there's ice, and they're like, oh my god, an iPad, that's so crazy that we can do that these days with technology. What's the difference between that adult and that child? It's that that child who's very, very young still hasn't developed a box to put their conception of reality into. They haven't developed a solid paradigm to kind of box up reality, so to speak. They don't have any expectations because they're still just gathering information and developing a structured idea of reality. And that happens pretty fast, right? You're probably, by the time, I don't know, you're 3, 4, 5, you're already starting to develop expectations. And by the time you're 10, you definitely have certain expectations of how life should be, because then your expectations can be defied and you're surprised because you're like, oh, you're not supposed to do that. You never hear a 3-year-old, if they could speak, say like, oh, you're not supposed to do that. They might get upset, but they won't say you're not supposed to do that because they don't know what life is supposed to be like at all. Quick example for the adults in the crowd could be like, you know, and I'm talking about this box that we create. This is something that goes way up into big kinds of beliefs about like your scientific beliefs about like how the universe began, your beliefs about how marriage should be, your beliefs about how your parents should act with you. Those are pretty big macro level beliefs. On another level, we're talking micro beliefs that are basically happening every second inside your mind, and they are literally articulating your entire reality when you walk out into the world. If that sounds crazy, all I'm really trying to say is, for example, like, if you've watch this video for the last 5 minutes and notice that my hair has this like funny top bun, or that I have like a beard that's maybe longer than the average person you see in the street. If you even notice that and were like, oh, he has like a weird hairdo, or even noticed that he has an unusual haircut, or even registered that like, oh, he's got like something on his head, that's your brain on a very subtle level saying, oh, he doesn't match my idea of what the average person looks like, or at least he doesn't fit within the broad spectrum of what most of the people I see in my life look like. And that's why your brain notices that something's different. They're like, oh, that's a really colorful bathrobe. Oh, that's an unusual way to have your hair. That's your brain saying like, oh, this is how life usually looks. And oh, he's breaking that a little bit. And so you notice. And that's happening every single day, right? It's the thing in your mind that if you suddenly go to a party and you're, I don't know, you're not African American, and you show up at a party and it's all black, you're suddenly like, oh, this is different. Why is that? Because usually you're at parties where it's not all black. And so suddenly your mind is like, oh my gosh, this is different. You might not say that's bad or good. You might be even comfortable or uncomfortable. It doesn't even, in this case, matter. I'm talking about just how your mind is registering that experience. It is based on your box, that you're this paradigm, and it's shifting all the time. But the older you get, I think the harder and stiffer it becomes. And that's why the older generation, generally speaking, is more rigid and more unable to accept change compared to youth, and even more so with children, right? Children can accept anything for the most part, and that's good and bad. That can be very bad. But they're willing to shift their paradigm all the time because they don't really have a solid one. But once you have someone who's like 60, 70 years old, oftentimes, if they're not open-minded, it's so rigid by that point. It's very hard for them to open themselves and change their idea of life. So that's the first thing, is to realize that when I'm talking about your perspective, I'm talking about that kind of box that's defining your expectation of life. Next thing. Okay, so when I'm talking, so that's kind of your, whether you know it or not, it's most of this box is subconscious. It's not something that you're actually very aware of. It's just happening in your mind all the time, and you're referring to it, right? So when I say, and so in a way that's your normal, because if you're somebody who probably is African American or lives in an African American neighborhood or has a lot of African American friends, and you're at parties all the time where everyone's African American, that is your box, and it's normal and it's fine. And so if you walk into a room and it's all African American, you're just like, you don't even notice. Just like you wouldn't even notice that my hair's like this if everybody in your life had a bun like that, right? So anyway, that's point number one. The next point I'm going to make is radical thinking in a nutshell is something that is completely outside this box. Now, when I say completely outside this box, I don't mean, for example, you are liberal and conservative is outside of your box. I don't mean that, because conservative is still inside your box. It's still inside your idea of where you can go in reality. Your box is not just always what you believe. If you go out and you see a liberal and you're like, oh, that's like me, and you see a conservative and you're like, oh, I don't like those guys, or oh, those guys are just different from me, those guys are still within your box. Just like the frame, let's just pretend the frame of this iPhone camera is the box. Like, it's still you and then them, but it's still inside the box. It's not over here, right? It's not over there. You can see all the pieces, right? And for most of us, we can't even imagine what's outside of that box. Like, a lot of us just stay in this box our entire lives, and we don't even think that we're missing anything. We think that this is where everything resides, right? You can listen to NPR and they talk about everything in the box, And you really can think that, oh yeah, NPR discusses everything. There's nothing outside of the box that NPR couldn't discuss. But when I say radical thinking, I'm talking about something that's like way outside, right? Way outside. So let's think about like what could that even be, right? So quick example is for me to say one thing, which is that everything that is normal now in 2014, 15, Happy New Year, everybody. Everything that is normal now inside most people's boxes was not normal 200 years ago. Like, was not normal, was not even in their box, right? And you're thinking like, what am I talking about? Let's go way back and let's talk about, this is fucked up that I keep messing with black people here, but it's really not my intention. But this is the example I'm going to give, which is back in the day when slavery was just a thing. And I'm not talking about like Civil War. I'm talking pre-Civil War, when everyone was like, this is just how shit is, right? For the most, there may have, I don't know, but there may have been a conversation, for example, on NPR back then, for example, and they're like, well, there are these new slave owners that really think that you should like treat your slaves very well. And then there's another group that's like, oh man, slaves are just property. Like I should be able to do whatever I want with them. And that was like a conversation in the box. And some people were like, oh man, I think that these guys are right. And other people were like, nah, you should be able to do whatever you want. And that was the conversation, right? That's like A and B. And no one could really ever, like people took their sides and people were in between, but nobody was like, how many people were walking into that room and saying like, I think we should free slaves and that slavery shouldn't exist anymore? Everyone would just be like, that's not even in the conversation. Like, and here's the thing, there were people, of course, that lived back then, very few, I would argue, who were especially in the privileged group that were having this conversation, that really were like, oh yeah, we should free slaves. And because they knew at that time, even though these days in 2015, how many people would say that? Like, of course, slaves should be free. Like that's so beyond normal for us that we don't even consider talking about it. But back then, it was a conversation. Like liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican. Like this is a conversation. Like this was an issue back then, and there were people like I think maybe Mark Twain fits in this category where he was basically like, he lived in a time that he was thinking so outside of, but he was still forced to live in that time. So he was like, in his own mind, he was like, slavery's fucked. Like, but I'm living in a world where everyone's having this conversation. And so if I come out and say like, hey guys, why don't we just not have slaves? He realizes that is so radical that it would like blow the minds of everybody that he's talking to, and maybe get himself in a lot of trouble because they're just like, it's just so against the box that everybody else is inside. But obviously that has changed over the course of history, because now we are in a time where that's so normal that no one is talking about it, right? Like slavery's over, like for the most part, obviously there's human trafficking, other issue. But the point is like that back then, this even saying like slavery should be over, that was fucked up. That was radical. That was massively radical back then. And so that's what I mean when I'm talking about a radical thought, right? It's so outside of the time. It's so far ahead. And so to relate a few things to right now, for example, I think things like, and these are fabulous things, amazing things, but like, gay rights, women's rights, feminism, a lot of the things we talk about, even things we say about climate change, whatnot, these are amazing. These are good conversations that we're having. However, they're not radical anymore. 50 years ago, 100 years ago, to say like, oh, women should be treated like this, gays should be able to marry. Those were radical 50 to 100 years ago. Those were radical thoughts because nobody was thinking about that. These days, everyone's talking about it for the most part. I'm talking from New York and America. It's a very specific locale, but still, that is so much in the box that while of course we should have this conversation, and it's a conversation that needs to be done. There needs still a ton of groundwork to do, all of that stuff. I'm not saying anything like radical is better than anything else. I'm not trying to say that. But I'm trying to emphasize like that stuff now that maybe some people think like, oh, I'm on the radical end of this. It's still in the box now, right? It's not truly radical in the sense that you have to depart completely from the conversation being had to even engage in those thoughts, right? And so when I'm talking about radical thoughts, once again, it's like not even in this box, like really far out. And it's not that, I'll be talking about things that only I've ever thought of, but it's things that I think for the most part, nobody's really talking about very much. It's very much on a minor scale, or maybe I'm just not aware of where it's being spoken of, but still, it's just unknown stuff for the most part. Let's see. Right. There's one more point I wanted to make. Let's see. I think it was this. Sorry about the break. Okay, so I guess what I wanted to add was like most people then are stay in this box their whole life and they don't realize that. And so by introducing some of these kind of more radical ideas, I want to, first off say like I'm not trying to make anybody uncomfortable. I'm not trying to push anybody. But I'm trying to have a sort of create a space where, maybe we can stretch our minds a little bit. We can wrap our minds around ideas that are pretty crazy, because I think these days we don't do that very much. We almost discourage people to leave the box. When you have a thought that's a little bit crazy, what instead we do in this society is we submerge it. We put it in our subconscious, or we just don't talk about it, or we put it into some crazy art and we just don't. That's it. We don't relate it to our lives. We don't try to believe it. We don't try to integrate it in our lives for sure, because we think it's just like, oh man, that's so crazy. I mean, you look out in the streets of New York City, so-called, great point of fashion, and you see everyone, in my view, dressing within the box. Like they all dress in the same range. Even the people that are dressing super crazy, it's just this corner of the box instead of this corner, but it's all in the box. No, very, very few people are dressing outside completely, But of course, like I said, human progress, to some degree, if not majority, is paved by the introduction of new ideas that at first seem radical, like, oh, hey, we should just free slaves. And then it's accepted by the majority and it becomes normal. But unless we get more comfortable with introducing radical ideas, we're going to hugely cut down on the creativity, the fluidity of life, and I think truly your ability to think and live the most full life that you can, because life is not this, and it's like, it's so vast and it's so incredible, and you need to be, and history has shown, and it will show us again if it must, that no matter how much you think your civilization is advanced, it's still just one more place that people think, oh yeah, we got it all figured out. And then it's like, boom, radical thought. Boom, new normal. Boom, radical thought. Boom, new normal. It's always evolving. And I know, guys, that we're in 2015 and we think we're so awesome, but it's not that different from 200 years ago. That's a very short amount of time. We are going to learn things about this universe that are going to completely change our paradigm. And so we need to accept that. And we need to learn then how to cultivate thinking outside of this box to make progress. Very last thing, because this shit is going over 20 minutes, this shit is way too long. Actually, it's not, because fuck the paradigm. Like, you can do a video as long as you want, and if people want to watch, they'll watch. So anyway, the last thing I'll say is, you know, this stuff I talk about, like, I understand it sounds crazy sometimes, the stuff I will be talking about. I understand it may sound crazy, and for some of you it might not even be really understandable, because I'm using language that you're maybe familiar with to articulate things that are completely outside your familiar zone. And for a lot of us, that's very uncomfortable. And so it's okay for you not to maybe understand it first, and that's not like me being smarter than you or anything. It's just like I'm trying to describe things that are really far out there. And part of the reason I'm doing this is to share that stuff, just to, you know, to bounce it back, and maybe somebody's like, oh yeah, I've already heard of that here, or somebody's like, oh, you know, that's crazy and it's totally not true. I'm open to that. I'm not saying this stuff is true, but I'm saying, like, we've got to stretch. Like, we're getting, you know, if you're in your 20s, like, we've got to learn how to not be in a box all the time, but to at least be in like a moving sphere, and like, let's make this thing grow, because if you stop learning, you know, you're gonna die. So that's the introduction for radical thinking. You know, so I'm looking forward to it. And if you've made it this far, thank you very much for watching. And mwah, happy birthday, Ali. It's your birthday. And cheers, everybody. Let's have a good year.